Hello everybody and welcome back. What we're going to work on today is kind of like what we looked at with demand before, which is the elasticity, in this case of supply. So the first thing I'd like to do today is to kind of recap over the movement of these supply curves that we looked at yesterday. And so let's get a little bit of practice here. So what I'd like you to do is in a second I want you to pause me, and then on a sheet of paper I want you to write down 1 through 7. And I want you to tell me whether each of the scenarios would increase or decrease the supply of shoes, and whether it would shift the curve to the right or to the left. So you're going to look at each of these and try to figure out if it would move the supply curve to the right or to the left, or if it would move it along the curve, in the case of a change in quantity supply. So go ahead and pause me and work on this, and then we'll pick back up and look at the rest of it. All right, welcome back. And so we'll look at all of these different scenarios in just a second and kind of talk about how it's going to shift the curves. But one big thing I want to look at first is how outside influences can affect our supply of goods. All right, so these external situations are things that are going on with other countries that are going to impact our own country. And so a good example of this that happened last year was there was this big oil rig in Iraq. It was attacked by terrorists, or maybe it was Saudi Arabia. It was attacked by terrorists. Anyway, this one oil rig produces about 5% of the world's oil. So it's vitally important to the oil supply. All right, and so as you can imagine, this oil, all right, so I still don't think that this oil rig or whatever, oil well thing, is back up and running yet. So since there was a big drop in oil production, our supply of oil across the world decreased. And so about a week or two after that oil rig got hit, we could see gas prices jump by about 15 or 20 cents here in the United States. Like everywhere in the United States, it got more expensive. All right, and you can see the same kind of thing with import restrictions, like with Cuban cigars is a good example, right? It makes sense that since they're not allowed to be in the country, since they're illegal, we have an embargo on Cuba, all right, and the prices of them are going to rise really high. All right, and so whenever we get into international economics, we're going to look at our current trade war with China, how we've been going back and forth, putting restrictions onto each other in regards to trade, and how that's made a lot of things more expensive over time. All right, so the first thing that I want to do is look at how our supply curve is going to shift in these different scenarios. So again, the easiest way to remember is to think about Ertl the turtle. All right, so whether it's a supply curve or demand curve, if it's increasing, it'll move to the right. If it's decreasing, it'll move to the left. All right, so let's take a look at it now. So with for 50 cents, let's say that we'd be willing to buy or supply one pair of shoes, right? So at 50 cents, we're not going to really make a lot of money. But as the price goes up to $2, we're going to be willing to supply more and more. At $4, all right, we're going to be willing to supply 6. So our supply at each level is increasing. So let's say that it costs 25 cents to make a pair of shoes. All right, so at 50 cents, we're making a profit, a very small profit, and so we'd be willing to provide one pair. All right, so let's say that the cost of leather increases. Well, if the cost of leather increases, then the cost of making the shoes is going to increase as well. Let's say that it costs $2 to make a pair of shoes now. All right, so then we wouldn't be able to provide any at 50 cents or $1, $1.50. $2, we're still not making a profit. All right, so all of these would be zero. All right, but let's say at $2.50, now I can start making some money. So maybe I would supply a pair of shoes, right? And as the prices go up, I'd be willing to supply more and more because now I'm making a bigger profit. All right, so if our supply is decreasing, this curve is going to move to the left. Our supply curve will shift to the left. All right, let's look at the next one. And these are from the opener a moment ago. Yeah, so let's take a look at this. All right, so the government subsidizes small footwear companies. All right, so with this, if the government's giving extra money to these shoe companies, all right, the goal is to make the shoe companies or the shoes cheaper for people, probably to make sure that everyone can afford the shoes. All right, so in that case, the supply of shoes is going to increase because now we can make more at the same price. Right? Before, at 50 cents, we weren't making much of a profit, so we'd only produce one. But if the government's giving us extra money, then now maybe we produce 3. And so the government does this all the time with farmers, right? So in Georgia, the government subsidizes farmers in order to grow corn and cotton and things like that, but they don't give those same subsidies for tobacco. And so for that reason, our farmers are more likely to grow the cotton and the corn, and they're less likely to grow the tobacco. All right, so Congress passes a law increasing the number of safety regulations in shoe factories. Well, if the factories have to meet all of these new safety regulations, chances are it's going to make it harder to supply these shoes, all right, because now they've got to jump through all of these extra hoops in order to do it. So safety regulations generally decrease the supply of a good. I mean, think about alcohol and cigarettes, right? So the government puts all of the strain on alcohol and cigarette companies. That way it limits their supply of the good. It makes it more difficult to produce it. All right, so if the price of shoes were to double, let's say from $2 to $4, then our curve wouldn't actually move. That wouldn't be a change in supply. It would just be a change in quantity supplied, right? We'd be willing to supply more shoes, all right, because we're making a bigger profit. So if there's a change in price, curve doesn't move. All right, so the number of private shoe manufacturers doubles, right? So think about this right now. If right now we have one shoe company and at 50 cents they're selling 1 pair, at $2.50 they're selling 4 pairs, at $4 they're selling 6 pairs. Well, if we open up a second company, a second shoe store, it makes sense that we would sell more shoes at the same price. So our supply would increase if we're providing more of that. All right, new computer programs enable better testing of rubbers and chemicals before assembly, right? So if we've got better technology now, that's going to increase our supply of these shoes, because now we don't need people to make it as much anymore. We've got technology that can do it instead. So if you look at Henry Ford and the assembly line, this is kind of the idea behind it. By getting this new technology, he was able to mass produce vehicles. All right, the government imposes an import ban on foreign luxury shoes. All right, so in that case, our domestic, all right, in this case I should have put like a parentheses or something like that. Our overall number of shoes, our supply would decrease. But if we're looking at the number of shoes that we would produce, then that would increase, because now we've got to make up for that lack of foreign shoes. So we did the same kind of thing with food, right? So we put a lot of, or not food, with like minerals, like aluminum and steel. So usually we get most of our aluminum and steel from China, but we put all of these import restrictions on them, these quotas and these tariffs on them. And so because of that, American steel producers and American aluminum producers have started to produce more. All right, and so the second thing I want to look at is the elasticity of supply. All right, what can change our supply of goods? All right, in 1 second, let me get a sip of water. So just like with demand, when we're looking at elasticity of supply, we're looking at how easily our supply can change based on a change in price. So, like, let's say we're looking at extra credit. Extra credit would have a very elastic supply. I can make extra credit out of nowhere if I want. I could give everybody 1,000,000 points of extra credit. So my supply is pretty much endless there. So my supply would be very elastic here. It can easily change with the price. All right, if supply is inelastic, that would mean that it would be hard to change the supply of it. So with that, you could think about our basketball arena, right? That on our Brunswick High Glen Academy basketball game, that building is going to be packed out. No matter how many tickets we sell, we can't make any more seats in that basketball arena. We've got a fire code, and we can't go above a certain number. On graduation, it gets packed out, right? We wish we could make more chairs in there. That way we don't have to go to the stadium. So if a supply is inelastic, that means that it's not going to easily change. Another good example is to think about the pecan trees that got destroyed during Hurricane Matthew. So in West Georgia is where you can find most of the pecan trees. Well, when Matthew came through and wiped them out, they can't really easily increase their supply of these pecans, because it takes like a decade for a pecan tree to start producing pecans. So their supply would be very inelastic. So yeah, the biggest factor that can change elasticity is time, right? So if you give these farmers enough time, yes, they can produce more pecans, but as far as this year or next year goes, that supply is pretty inelastic. They can't drastically change it. Same thing with the basketball arena, right? Let's say that something happened to Glen Academy and all of Glen Academy students had to come over here. We couldn't drastically change our number of classrooms or the size of our gyms. So we would have to change as quickly as we could. We have to get portables or things like that. But in the short term, most goods are inelastic in their supply. You can't easily change them. All right, and so this is looking at an example of like our basketball arena or our football stadium, right? Whether we're selling tickets at $10 or whether there's a concert there and they're selling them for $50, that supply is going to stay the same, right? We're not going to easily be able to change the supply of the seats there. All right, we'll skip this and come back to it a little bit later. And the last thing I want to look at today are costs. Let me double check that this is what I wanted to look at. One moment. Yeah. Okay. All right. So when we're looking at costs, again, this is going back to what we looked at with fundamentals. With this marginal product of labor. So you're trying to find the right balance, right, to make sure that you're producing as much as you can without your costs outweighing your benefits. So I always like to think about Willie's as a good example here. Willie's Winnie Wagon or Angel's Cafe, if you've ever been there. Like, they're at max capacity. They're both really small restaurants, and like they are jammed busy every lunch rush. All right, and so for them to be any more productive, they would have to move into a bigger location. But the owners are understandably worried because if they move into a bigger location, then they have to worry about their costs exceeding their benefits. All right, and so increasing marginal returns, that's when we're adding or subtracting one of something and we're gaining value with that. So if I'm a manager and I'm calling in a worker because we're slammed busy, I'm hoping that that worker will get me more money that I'm going to spend on them. Decreasing marginal returns, you can think about the end of a shift, right? If you work at a restaurant, it's like 8 or 9 o'clock at night, chances are your manager is going to try to send people home because they're losing more than they're making at that point. They're getting decreasing marginal returns. So when we're looking at costs, when we're looking at supply, a big thing we need to look at is costs. And we break these up into a couple different types. So fixed costs would be anything that you've got to pay regardless of how much you produce. So like, let's say you open up a restaurant, right? The fixed cost would be the mortgage that you have to pay on it, or the insurance, right? You're going to pay these things regardless of if they're open or closed. All right, variable costs will change based on how much is produced. So for this, think about the school, right? So teachers would be a fixed cost. I get paid whether school's in session or not. During the summer, I get paid the same as during the school year. So I would be a fixed cost. But the cafeteria workers would be variable costs. If the school's not open that day, they don't get paid. And so the variable cost will change with how much is produced. On the days that students are in school, our electricity bill goes up, our water bill goes up. All right, so the total cost is if you add these two together, right? And so the total cost for our school is millions of dollars every year. All right, or at least like over $1 million. Because I do know that the operating cost, or how much it costs per day, is about $10,000. All right, so I guess over the course of 300 days or 365 days or however many, I think that would be over a couple $1 million. I'm not that great with math, and I'm not about to sit down and get a calculator. But yeah, the operating cost would be, y'all got me concerned about my math. One second. Yeah, never mind. But okay, so yeah, the total cost is adding together these costs. Operating cost is looking at your costs per day. All right, we're not going to be able to do the tennis ball simulation. All right, but we'll leave it up here for now. Go ahead and switch over to the Google Classroom, and we'll talk about this just a little bit more.